Fabulous with Vips and Vicky. The ThinqShift podcast for professionals who aspire to be fabulous leaders. Those who not only succeed, but also purposefully seek to reinvent the world.
Welcome to another episode of our Be Fabulous podcast. Today, Vips and I are talking about a topic that is not an easy one to discuss. However, we feel it's important, as is one that comes up in our conversations with
because
executives.
we're mad.
Yeah, and Vips, we are a little mad because we did go back and forth whether we should even talk about this topic or not. And then we found a way to talk about it through the lens of fabulousness. It's an inherently complex topic. It's often not explicitly discussed, and it's the topic of fairness. And the reason it's so tough is, believe it or not, fairness is different for everybody. You know, as we really dove right into this, we realized this is not straightforward at all. It's emotive. It's culturally loaded. There are differences across countries, across states, across communities, organizations, gosh, and even families. Yet, almost everyone will want to think that they're being fair and that they share the same definition of fairness with everyone else. However, that just simply isn't the case. And so what seems so obvious is not true to everyone else if it's true to you. We're going to look at our fabulous definition of fairness. So Vips, we seem to use words like being fair, treating someone equally with someone else. We tend to use these words interchangeably. However, I'm not sure we have a clear definition of what all these things mean. Why don't we start with some of these terms and how to look at them through the fabulous lens to get grounded?
Yeah, this one, it's such a rich one, and I'm glad it's not that easy. Is probably more apt for this one than probably all the other ones we've done by some order of magnitude. And for me, the way I always look at it, and maybe the path we're going to go down today really is, we did like a whole series on 5 levels of thinking, and this one I think you have to start right at the top at the philosophical level, because it just turns out there's no universal definition of fairness.
Remind people of the 5 levels before we go to the top.
Yeah, so if you remember, the 5 levels were tactical level of thinking, which is the one that is like the lowest level, and the quick feedback loops, action, response, decisions, that kind of thing. Operational thinking, which is more about goals, metrics, process, policy. Then you've got structure,
and that drives the tactics.
That drives the tactics. And then you have the structural, which is then how you are reacting, like how you're structuring either your organization or your community or your group or whatever to optimize for what's happening at the next level up, which is the world. So when we think of things like organizational structure, when we think about changing markets or new divisions or new lines of business or new product areas, that's all structural things. Okay. Then we have systemic, which would be really everything that's happening in the world around us that's shaping how we need to react to it. And then right above systemic, would be philosophical. So, this one probably has to go all the way to the top.
Which is our values and views of how we see the world.
Yeah, and also just, when you get deeply into existential type questions, you're up at the sort of philosophical level, and this one needs to start there.
Well, let's start there then, Vips. It's a good reminder.
Yeah, so we could spend, I don't know, an entire series on this topic, but what I always go is like, just let's at least talk about what the different types of definitions around fairness, just so we kind of have a sense that, oh shit, we're kind of working with something that in itself is a kind of moving target. Okay. So you know me, I always go back to sort of my political philosophy roots is kind of where I normally go back to. So, you got the kind of Aristotelian definition of fairness, which kind of emphasizes the idea of, distributive justice. It's basically where fairness is achieved when stuff, goods, products, whatever it is, are distributed in proportion to merit, effort, or need. Okay. So again, all that really does is, it gives you this kind of concept, but then it just pushes the definitions further down. Okay, so what is merit? What is effort? What is need? So but the idea fundamentally is you get justice when things are allocated fairly. Okay, that's basically what that's saying. Then you have kind of sort of John Rawls' kind of theory of justice, which is kind of, he defines it through two principles, which are, one is the sort of equal liberty principle, which is that ultimately each person should have some claim to some basic liberties. You can think of them as basic human rights that are compatible with that, but they have to be compatible with other people's liberties. So you can't, and that's also fuzzy because everyone's going to have a slightly different definition about what that is relative to someone else. And then the second principle he talks about is the difference principle, which is that in social and economic equalities, they need to be arranged for the benefit of the least advantaged members of society, and offices and positions should be open to everybody, irrespective of, under the conditions of fairness, equality, and access. Okay, so, and the idea is that stuff is secondary to the sort of basic rights as expressed through the equal liberty principle. So you can already see that that's kind of mushy as well. And a lot of sort of law will lean on these sorts of principles. Okay. And then another one, which is, at the philosophical level, or political philosophical level, is, procedural fairness. And this is kind of what the lawyers like, right? So this comes from the Kantian view of the world, Kantian ethics view of the world, which is fairness is really just about making sure due process has been followed. Like the methods to get to the decisions are fair and just, irrespective of what the actual answers end up being. Okay. So, I mean, just there, you've got like one sort of universe of mayhem and mess, right? In
different approaches.
Yeah, but then you've got legal definitions, right? So then you've got things like due process, equality before the law, legal fairness, says that law should apply to everyone, irrespective of discriminatory features, whatever those features may be. Okay, so you got legal ones. Then you've got economic definitions of fairness, where fairness is in equitable distribution of resources and individual freedom must take into account not only material wealth, but opportunities to achieve those. Okay, so you got that kind of thing. Then you got welfare economics, where fairness comes from having almost like a basic safety net. And then you got things like game theory, which says that fairness is, in theory, can be described as concepts like equilibrium and envy-free allocations. Like when you can allocate things out so no one's envious of anyone else, then you've won, right? Maybe, right? So then you get to the fundamental, well, humans wired that way, right? So then you get into the psychological perspectives of fairness, which are things like the equity theory, which comes from social psychology, that that kind of basically says that fairness is judged based on the ratio of inputs relative to the outputs or the rewards. So this kind of falls into that. If it feels like a equitable exchange of energy, then it must be fair, right? But then one person's definition of an equitable return on energy, I mean, you're talking about a level of self-awareness. Kind of have to be pretty high up Maslow's hierarchy of needs to even understand that, and 99% of people don't. So I mean, you got that kind of problem. But then you've got social contract theory, which that's kind of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, but that's like a society agreement that kind of we all agree to follow these rules because they're collectively in our best interest, and they act as constraints while and we'll do that because ultimately it's all of our benefits that we don't end up killing each other, right? That kind of stuff. Okay. And so essentially what they are like concessions on our individual liberty for collective benefit, right? And I mean, if you think about that, most of the big topics in American politics fall on that axis,
Yeah.
And then you also have like, this idea of almost like a sort of algorithmic way of looking at fairness, which is things like, if decisions are made and they would be the same as if they were made with a different group of people, then that must be fair. Or in a different country. So if you can find the generic truth that applies everywhere, then that must be a truth, and therefore that's fair. Okay, that's almost like a scientific way of generalizing. You get fairness through that kind of lens. So, I mean, we could go. I mean, then you get to ethics and morality, even. Utilitarian fairness. Fairness looks like when the greatest number of people achieve the greatest levels of happiness. That's fair. Okay, but that still means a bunch of people aren't happy, are miserable, and so forth, right? So So I probably just stop there. And all that just to illustrate that this is like a universe of knowledge, and we could spend our whole lives, right, just trying to work out if any specific thing that we do in the professional environment or working environment or with our families or with our friends or in our communities is fair, because you will definitely be able to argue it 10 ways from Sundays in either direction.
So it's a topic that's inherently complex.
I'd say chaotic.
And fuzzy.
I think it's beyond. I think it's beyond complex. I think it's truly chaotic because most people won't even have, like, even just the things I just went through there in whatever it was, 5-6 minutes. Most people don't have that level of perspective even to understand that, man, there's like 500 different ways of looking at this. Okay.
Yeah.
So the likelihood of getting to a place where we have sufficient education across all of those things against the body of knowledge, the universe of stuff that you could know about, you're just not going to achieve that at sufficiently high levels society-wide.
Yeah, and yet we think it's so simple. It's so obvious to me. Why aren't they doing this? That's what fair is.
So kind of where I kind of landed with Vicky, I kind of posit this out there, and I think this is one of those ones that I think of as like a working definition that we use for fabulousness, in the context of the work we do, that I think is sufficiently complex that makes you it opens the door to exploring the complexity while also giving you a quite succinct definition that you can use as like a mental check when you find yourself in these kind of sort of, they're almost like moral and ethical dilemmas that we could experience through all sorts of practical day-to-day issues at work or in professional leadership. Like, I'll give you a simple one, like is it fair to ask people to come back to the office after remote work? Okay.
Yeah, and what's a fabulous definition?
Yeah, so the way I express it, and you probably have to break this down for all of us, but I think the way I look at it is fairness is really, from a working day-to-day definition, at least in the fabulous leadership world, is fairness should be an aspirational intent based on some kind of philosophical premise, which basically means that it's an aspirational intent based on how you would like to see the world improved. Okay? That is constrained, and how much you can get there is fundamentally constrained by the normative beliefs of the society, country, city, organization, or group or bubble that you happen to be in. So I might think fairness for a particular topic looks like X in the ideal world, but ultimately the constraints on X will be how much can the environment that I'm in move towards that without creating a counterforce that does more harm than good.
Okay. Well, let's talk through a few examples. But before we do that, it sounds like in layman's term, fairness is an idea, a concept that will never really be reached. It's an aspirational view that we have. And the reason it's hard for us to reach it is because of the constraints of the society we live in, the cities we live in, the organizations we might work for, the family we grew up in, the communities we're in.
I think it's even deeper than that, Vicky. I think it's because, and this is kind of a hard thing, all of us are inherently fair and inherently unfair all the time. It's just we like to talk about when we are fair and we don't like to talk about when we are unfair, right? And so I think it's almost down to a part of the human condition.
Yeah.
So it's never, ever going to be truly achieved.
So what would be an example of when we're fair and unfair?
Well, it's the things we choose to care about fairness for and the things we choose not to care about fairness for.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So let's say,
Mm-hmm.
well, how many times have we said to people, focus on your sphere of control, not on your sphere of influence? Right? Because you can only control what you can control. Or control your controllables is another one you hear in the corporate world an awful lot. Well, that's another way of saying ignore all the other injustices.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we have all sorts of rationalization, justification, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's also necessary because, I mean, honestly, you can't go through, well, it's very difficult to go through life and, embrace every cause of fairness.
Yeah, for sure.
So you have to know what you care about, I guess.
And it makes any type of leadership decision either experienced as fair or unfair, depending on the person who's being affected
Yeah,
by
and it's
it.
even richer than that, right? I mean, you've heard me say it before many, many times. I don't think we've said it on a podcast, but the job of a good executive is to keep everyone equally miserable. You've heard me say that before, right? And it's really because if you're striving for things that are in your definition, or sorry, in your view, fair or good leadership or taking a stand or taking a position or whatever it may be, you are by definition going to alienate, I don't know, some, close to a third of people who disagree with you. You probably get a third on side who will say, thank God. And then you'd have another third that will blow in the wind. And this is kind of why, this is kind of why fabulous leadership, or any kind of leadership, is so important. Like, and the people have to truly understand that it sucks. I mean, you're in for a lot of criticism. You're in for a lot of pain. You're in for a lot, in today's age, you're in for a lot of hate. You're in for a lot of abuse. And my view is this is one of the reasons why some of the people with the best potential to be good leaders are just opting out, because the emotional and social toll of that is too high on themselves. So it's kind of hard to go for well-being and leadership at the same time, right? Because you're putting yourself in the conditions where you're inviting hate, misery, pain, anguish. And it's kind of why leadership isn't for everyone. And most people just want an easy life.
Yeah. Vips, it reminds me of a TED talk that I went to, and a prosecutor was sharing a situation. He was talking about fairness and equality. And he talked about a situation where he was prosecuting two individuals who'd both been pulled over for a DUI. And one was an undocumented immigrant, and one was a Silicon Valley tech worker. Now, the penalty for that incident would be the same. It'd be, let's make it up, I forget exactly the details, but let's say it's like, $1,000 and, a night in jail. To an undocumented immigrant, that could be a life or death decision, given that level of money would be almost impossible for them to get. Plus, it could get them out the country pretty quickly. But for someone in Silicon Valley, it's just like a little slap on the wrists, something to brag about. So then the question becomes, how do you be fair in that kind of situation? What does that look like? And that really got my juices flowing in terms of what is this whole thing about fairness. And shortly after that, I was working with a manager who wanted to treat everybody fairly. That was their mode of operandi. And the one way it came out is everybody has to work the same hours. And this is way before COVID and way before, in the office and that kind of thing, To be fair, everyone should come in at 9 and everyone should leave at 5. And the pushback they got was those people that were knocking it out of the park in terms of sales, like overachieving beyond their sales targets, they would push back and say, well, why does it matter as long as I'm achieving the goals and I'm there a reasonable amount of time? Why do I have to be there in such a rigid way? And then you've got the others who aren't performing. And what does that look like? And actually I had a conversation last week with an organization who's looking at the whole back to work situation, because the tide, as we know, is all turning on that one. And they monitor, they're a professional services organization. They monitor people come in 3 days a week. They're meant to come in 3 days a week. They monitor it, but they use it in a very interesting way where if you are delivering your goals, it doesn't get used against you whether you come in for the required days or not. But if you're not performing, then it becomes a conversation to drive those kind of actions.
Which sounds wonderfully good in theory, right? But here's the
For
problem,
sure.
right? All it does is put the subjectivity down to those goals and those metrics, right?
Which have to be really good to start with.
And they have to be really stable, and neither of which
Yeah.
ever hold true.
True.
Right? Because we live, I mean, we talk about it all the time. Teams need to be agile. They need to change quick. They need to respond quickly to market demands. We live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. So to me, that kind of thing, what you just expressed, is a very static definition of something that seems fair on the surface until you run it for 3, 6, 9, 12, 18 months. And you find all it's done is pushed the unfairness to another. It's pushed it down the chain from philosophical to systemic to structural to operational down to tactical. So ultimately, what you'll find, because I tell you why, what it fundamentally boils down to is there's no universal way of measuring productivity or doing a good job. Let's not call it productivity. Let's call it doing a good job. Because is doing a good job literally how many words you write if you're a writer? Or is doing a good job having the character and personality to make people want to follow you? Are those things the same? So what if you got two people, right? One's an arsehole to work with and one's a really nice person to work with, but they're both got the same level of productivity measures. Therefore, their results and their output are exactly the same in the tactical sense, in the measurable sense. Okay. Are you treating those two people fairly when it comes to promotion?
Yeah. And you see the same, in the world of sales. Someone achieves their numbers, both people achieve their numbers, but one is the jerk that no one wants to be around, and the other one is a good team player.
By the way, but I guess the other way to look at fairness there would be to say, well, okay, some organizations don't care if you're a good team player or not, as long as you achieve the results. And some organizations do care that you're a team player, because that's part of being culturally aligned with the environment you're in. So there's nothing actually wrong with that, because ultimately those people are going to wash out or get pushed out or choose to leave off their own accord. And ultimately the system will calibrate itself, because they'll end up in environments where whatever behavior pattern they choose to exhibit will be acceptable at a given price, and therefore the system is fair.
Yeah. And then it's just you working in those organizations to decide if it's fair to you or not, and something you can put up with.
What I just said there, by the way, would probably, it's a stake through the heart of talent professionals and HR professionals, right? Because it's like an excuse to give up, right, on people, right?
Yeah.
But it's, my point is, right, if you take that example, even you might find something doesn't seem fair or just at a tactical or operational level, but makes complete fairness if you look at it at the systemic or structural level.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's look at one more example, Vips. So,
can we stay on remote work for a second? All right, because to me, this one gets so. I mean, this one is. I think this is one of those complex ones that's coming out. Is also that one also had the consequence. To me, this is an example of when the world reacted. Sorry, I'm talking about the professional world, right? When the professional world reacted under COVID-19, right, effectively, we were operating in crisis mode. I'm talking about everyone was operating in crisis mode. And as such, what actually happened was everyone went straight to pragmatism. Like, what do we have to do right now?
Yeah, okay? Tactics.
So put another way, wisdom went out the window. Right? It's just wisdom was irrelevant. Yeah.
Well, because you're trying to keep safe.
You're trying to keep safe, or you're worried about about dying or whatever, right? And I mean, like, literally dying as well as organizationally suffering, right? I mean, at every level. Okay. So basically, we're down now in high tactical action with very little genuine consideration for long-term impact, because you don't know if you're going to be alive or dead, right? And it's a pretty extreme example, right?
Yeah.
All right. So then what happens is a whole bunch of stuff gets implemented based on what's going to make people feel safe and good now. So the presenting problem wasn't what's the right answer. The presenting problem is what's the right answer right now, right? For business continuity. So guess what happens, right? We just got to find a way to get people working from home, right? Yeah. And we need to make sure we're optimizing for people feeling safe and so forth and so forth and so forth, right? So guess what happens, right? You can work from wherever you like. You can work from home. If you need to spend around your family and your family happens to be a couple of states away, we don't care. As long as you're getting your work done, it's all good. It's all good. It's all good. Because we systemically accepted a massively degraded level of, in quotes, productivity overall, just to keep going, right? Just to keep going. If we had been wise at that point, okay, probably wouldn't have gone down that road so quickly. But if we hadn't have gone down that road so quickly, our businesses might be dead because we wouldn't have been able to maintain continuity. So it kind of had to go that way. But that's also why, from a wisdom standpoint, you were always going to have recoil. You were always going to have recoil. And to me, the biggest challenge with it is because there's so many aspects of it, some of which are easy to quantify with quantifiable metrics, if you like.
Yeah,
but
productivity
others you can't quantify, and especially when you start talking about what does it do to your career growth path, what does it do to your overall career growth, human dynamics, leadership skills, all of that stuff, even just general loneliness, human interaction. And so suddenly, if you think about it, all of that meant that we then, rightly or wrongly, legitimized a whole bunch of personal well-being dimensions into our obligations as employers to employees, just to be good employers and to attract the best talent, right? So fast forward a bit, okay, and then guess what happens? Another assumption gets broken. Yeah, that war for talent isn't that real anymore. We don't actually need all of these people, and so actually we can pull back on well-being. We can pull back on flexibility. We can pull back on, fairy tale notions of fairness or equity, right? And because we need to get back to business, right? And so now that seems cool. So if you think that, wow, we've made so much progression because we've accepted all of these things as being fair, just, equitable, the right thing to do. Now, if you're a minority or a working parent or a caregiver, then absolutely those things were things you've been desperate for forever, that kind of flexibility, right? So you will experience regression. And, we made so many steps going towards fairness and equity, which we're now going backwards from. Right? But the reality was we pushed too far relative to what the normative beliefs could actually sustain, which goes back to the definition of fabulous fairness I gave you earlier. So if we'd been wise about it, like the fabulous people would know that what we're in is a temporary state, not something that's changed forever. Okay. And what's going to happen is there'll be a reversion, and some aspects of it will persist and other aspects will recoil because we pushed too far too quickly. But ultimately, if you look at it over a 10, 15, 20-year period, we still progressed.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make you feel any better if you're a working parent who is now screwed over because you have to go back to the office because Amazon demands you go back to the office.
Yeah.
But it was always going to happen.
Yeah. And for those of you that want to know more, our first episode this year dives into this whole thing, this topic of remote work through the lens of an organization, a CEO, etc. Because, as Vibs mentioned, productivity dimension is not just the work you do, but it's all the other dimensions of your growth, your leadership dimensions, etc. Which these things are not things that are widgets that could just be produced. It's complex, Vibs.
It's complex. I'll tell you where else it's complex. Sorry, you got me going now, right? It is that topic also. So when you're in a period where suddenly, no one's going to say this out loud, but where fundamentally you care about, let me phrase that, a business organization requires its people less than it did a year ago. Let's leave it at that, right? Or, okay, whether that's because you're restructuring because of the onslaught of AI, or because you're getting serious about performance, or whatever it is, or markets turning and your profits aren't where they used to be before, or whatever, okay? For whatever reason, then what you're going to experience is we're going backwards, okay? I'm angry. And so things that we do and that we have been doing for the last decade to create more quote unquote engagement, Let's call them engagement surveys. Let's call them sentiment analysis of how your team is feeling. What's the mood in the ranks? All of that stuff, right? Starts giving you disproportionately mixed signals because it's going to amplify the noise of the few. Yeah. Now, in a world where you care because resources are constrained, your talent constrained, you care a lot more about appeasing those things. In a world where you kind of want a bunch of people to leave anyway, right? And you'd rather them leave rather than have to pay them huge sums of money by way of severance. Okay. Even things like engagement tools and sentiment analysis they don't matter.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. But they get amplified through, so even our sort of talent systems and infrastructure inside our organizations have to adapt to kind of a different set of operating assumptions, which will feel grossly unfair relative to what you think the mission you think you've been fighting for the last 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
And that's why we say fabulous leaders have to be adaptable above and beyond everything else. And there's still going to be progress over the long term, but that long term is going to have 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And if you too tightly, sort of hitch your wagon to one thing, you're going to get really, really disappointed because it's going to go backwards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really hard.
So some takeaways from this part of the conversation is recognizing how complex it is and using wisdom not to push too far out, recognizing it's temporary.
And that's what we hope is, one thing I think pretty sure for most folks in the US is if you think about what that does, that's what drives extremism, right? So unless we can get back to a point where people start recognizing that actually that kind of change happens, it happens incrementally, slowly over time, right? Yeah. Then the sort of wisdom is seeing that change is only going to be very, very slow. All we're really doing is amplifying anger in the belief that by amplifying anger, we're adding to the conversation and it's going to create change faster. And what actually tends to happen is the force on whatever the other side is gets equally strong, and you still just end up in equilibrium. Just everyone's a lot more angry and everyone's a lot more miserable. And that ultimately doesn't bode well for society.
Yeah, which is only ever going to change in small steps anyway. Yeah. Okay. Well, we touched on this a little bit with the AI agenda, and that's how that's going to be impacting companies more and more over the next few years. And that's this topic of restructuring and layoffs. I mean, this is another great example where you sort of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you think about, we see a lot of this when leaders are thinking about or introducing new teammates and how best to do this. Let's look at the example of layoffs. You can use every kind of strategy from give them lots of notice, tell the leaders, tell the managers, tell the team, work through all the details, lots of notice, work through all the details. And then it freaks everybody the hell out because this nervousness of what this all means and the anticipation of it is something our brains, back to safety, just can't handle. Or we can wait to, on the day and then do the cascading on the day, or actually just do everyone together in a big town hall. And, there are pluses and minuses for all of these, but we each have our own view of how we wished it would have been handled. But you and I have seen it every which way. It all sucks. None of it's great. And I think through the fabulous
You can't make a sucky situation not sucky.
And through the fabulous lens, it's recognizing that there is no great way. And yeah, there's certain ways that have a little easier benefit on certain individuals, but for others, it's even more traumatic. So it's recognizing that this is one way it's a lose-lose.
Yeah, and what I would say is how much you can do to try to so basically you're damned if you do and damned if you don't anyway. But how pleasant, how close to pleasantness you can get will be constrained by two things fundamentally. One, fundamental financial constraints that an organization is in, okay? And two, the true extent of where the sort of the culture and values of an organization genuinely do prioritize those things versus saying they do. Okay. And really those are the two. That's why in some organizations where I'm coaching and I'm working with, it's like based on your environment and your financial conditions, you have to act quickly with minimum conversation and minimum dialogue with your people, because you don't have the benefit of the time or the cultural predisposition to do it in a more humane fashion. Okay, but in other organizations, if they took that approach, it would destroy.
It backfires anyway.
Backfires.
You know, even if you do the, can't see us because we're on podcast, but air quotes, even if you try and do it in a humane way, we've seen it backfire that way as well, but they made me feel so unsettled for the last few weeks and months.
And ultimately what this gets to, I mean, only way I can see out of this, right, is we, meaning the collective we, have to do a better job of developing people to be much more VUCA street smart. Actually, that's a good phrase. I'm going to use it. Street smart to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, rather than expecting things to be stable.
Or expecting that there's a right way for these things to be handled. Because what's right for you is going to be completely wrong for your colleague next to you.
Because the situation's different.
For sure.
And so I think, when we're trying to calibrate it within ourselves, there's kind of two ways of going. I mean, broadly speaking, there's lots of gray in the middle. And there's one way of going, which is these people only care about themselves. So it's kind of a very cynical response, right? Or the other approach is everyone's doing the best they can with what they have, right? And that's more of a compassionate first response. My view is that ultimately you get a better bounce back if you within your own self, you bounce back quicker. The organization bounces back. Your team bounces back quicker if you experience it. If you experience it through the lens of everyone's doing the best they can with what they have, right?
For sure.
If you go the other way, the speed of resilience, the speed at which you can respond, react, and get over it is much, much longer, which is ultimately not to your benefit or to your organization's benefit, your team's benefit, or your personal leadership's benefit.
Well, hopefully by listening to this podcast recording and some of our other episodes, those listening will get to see just how deep and complex this is, and that there isn't a right or wrong for any particular situation. For each person, each person's going to have their own view of the best way to do something. And if you get comfortable with the inherent complexity and don't assume it's easy and don't assume that there's a right or wrong way, that'll allow you to be more comfortable with, in these complex and ambiguous situations and volatile situations, literally everyone is doing the best they can based on the experience set. And even if there was a different way of handling it, it might have been better for you, but it might not have been better for somebody else.
Yeah. One sort of very practical thing people can do, right, is think of when they get into these topics of sort of what's fair, what's not fair, that kind of thing, probably just recognize out of the gate and treat it like a negotiated concept, as opposed to, I'm aboard by what you said, that's terribly unfair. I think this is where my view, you can only really make progress in what we would call a upper mode brain way, a blue-yellow way, as opposed to a emotional way, okay, or emotion. But the problem is, we also want people to be very passionate about the things that they feel fair about. So what it kind of double standards in the way we even talk about it. We want you to be passionate and drive with conviction and hold dear to the things that you really care about and canvas for it, fight for it, anchor for it, that kind of stuff, which is all great. But then understand that might make you feel really good, but actually how much progress you make is a totally different thing. And ultimately, if you decide that you feel better for being that kind of person, but that's great, but you're likely to be very much in the unaware to aware space rather than making anything systemically change anyway, which means you're likely to get pretty frustrated, pretty annoyed, pretty curmudgeon-y over time.
Yeah.
Unless you're just one of the true sort of, pseudo spiritual kind of leaders who can just elevate themselves above it all and, think about it through a 50, 100, 200 year kind of time horizon.
Where this all will pass.
Eternal optimists.
Yeah. Okay. So let's dive into what people can do about this. So the first step is to hopefully you've now been exposed to the complexity of all this and understand that it is inherently complex and that there is no easy way through this. What's another one, Vips?
My view is probably, I don't know if I think of it as a way through it. I think it's more about go back and really think about when you say on any given week, you're going to be making value judgments throughout that week. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's the fair thing to do. I think this is a fair way of treating my team. I think this is a fair decision. I think whatever it is. Okay. And every time you find yourself making a fairness-based value judgment, just go back and treat it as a self-reflection exercise. Is that actually true? In which situation would that not be true? Or for which people would that not be true? Therefore, is this something that I truly hold that dear, or is it something I feel comfortable negotiating a different point of view that might be relevant for different groups? So the point is, I think the goal here is to increase the sophistication of your understanding about your own definition of what something is fair, because ultimately that makes you more understanding. I don't want to go as far as say tolerant, but certainly makes you more understanding of different perspectives, which then allows you to navigate complexity better.
And for that, you might have to have some conversations with others
Absolutely.
to understand their view, right? Yeah, yeah. And by doing that, you really are going to be thinking whole brain. You're going to be looking at it through the lens of those that think perhaps the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. You might be looking at it in a way where, as you said earlier, fairness is something to aim for, but we'll never really get there. We'll never really succeed because of different perspectives. You might be looking at it through the lens of what can I personally live with? Where are my non-negotiables around this particular thing and the impact of it? And how can you do it in a way where there's minimal backlash?
Yeah, and pick. I mean, I know it sounds terrible, but pick your battles. I think one of the things that's changed systemically, like environmentally for us all, is we are just harassed constantly to care about a whole bunch of stuff that we wouldn't have even known about had it not been blasted to us through our phones 6 hours a day. Okay, and so I think there's no shortage of things marketed to us that we could feel bad about. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, anything, right? I mean, things going on in different countries. These are all things, right? Poverty, climate, social injustice. I mean, there's a whole host of things that are huge things where one would argue that our collective definition of fairness or justice is not quite right, or where atrocities are taking place or whatever. Okay. But the reality is, how many of those are you gonna like? How many of those do you truly have? Or not only do you have energy for, but actually could practically, sustainably engage in any kind of sensible way? And I think that to me, my biggest takeaway is don't think by retweeting something or adding a like or whatever that somehow you've done your bit, right? I think that's just a signal of, but these systems are designed to make us do that, right? And those things don't change just because we think we are agreeing to something someone says on LinkedIn or agreeing to something someone says on a tweet, or you know what I mean. But we are being played and manipulated all the time, and it's fighting for our own perceptions. It's trying to normalize different definitions of fairness for different situations. Yeah. And so everyone's in a kind of a collective, I mean, I'll be a little bit I don't know, rude. Everyone's kind of to get you to believe in their lie. And the truth is always more complex than any lie that's being projected. It doesn't mean there isn't some nugget of truth in all of those lies,
Yeah,
but it's all simplified bullshit because you got to get it into short, sharp sentences because no one's got any attention beyond 256 characters and a couple of nice pictures.
Yeah.
Which is really not what leadership is about. That's really more distracting the masses. I call that the magician, where you distract the masses.
And that's why fabulous leadership is so important, and our idea of personal power, of having followership based on what we will take a stand for, what we won't, how understanding we are.
But if we don't have fabulous leadership, we're just going to end up with an increasing concentration of power, an increasing concentration of greed, an increasing concentration of unfairness, and ultimately, war.
A backlash.
War. It goes to bad places.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well,
we've got to end on a positive note, though. Bring it back, Vicky. Say something positive.
All right. Well, hopefully, everyone, this has been valuable. We spent a bit of time thinking about, should we talk about this topic, should we not? But we see it coming up so much in the organizations in which we are working with leaders and coaching, and we thought it's important to open the lens on this topic because it's so easy to go to a place of this is fair, this is not fair. As a parent, you have that all the time with kids. This is fair, this is not fair. And having a broader understanding of there's many ways to approach it, and it's not that straightforward, I think, is the key here. So with that, Vips, any final last words?
Oh, I think all I would say is I'm still optimistic about it. I think it's worth it. Like, I think the more we spend time on concepts like this individually, in our teams, in our groups, in our communities, actually, ultimately, it results in better solutions, better answers, better directional nudging. I would just say, it's worth being intellectually curious and not being lazy when it comes to stuff like this, because ultimately, that's what will help reshape the world.
Yeah. Well said. So embrace the complexity, embrace the notion that everyone's doing the best they can, and you'll bounce back quicker. And so that, be fabulous. Till next time.